So before we get to the video about the FBI and their secrets, I was curious. I wanted to know, what is one of the FBI's biggest secrets? So I asked ChatGPT, right? Listen to this. It said the FBI has many secrets over the years, I bet. But one of the biggest and most controversial is the Cointelpro, which is the counterintelligence program. Right. It was a covert FBI program that ran from the 1956 to 1971, aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting civil rights groups, political organizations, and activists. This is why it's important that we get those Martin Luther King files next, right? Let's keep going. The program targeted figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, and even anti-Vietnam War activists. Yo, this is crazy. Listen. The FBI used illegal wiretaps, forged documents, smear campaigns, and intimidation tactics to undermine these groups. It was exposed in 1971 when a group of activists broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania and leaked files to the press revealing the extent of the FBI's operations. This led to public outrage and eventually congressional investigations into FBI abuses. Say no more. Say no more. We're going to get to the video now.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation was founded on the 26th of July, 1908. And as most of us know, they've conducted several secret operations of different kinds over the following decades. Now, many of these secret files have been declassified, and the public can learn what these operations were about and who was involved. Number 10, Operation...
Many have been declassified. Why not all? Why not all at this point? Huh? Again, one of the main ones we waiting on, MLK.
Solo started as a means for the FBI to keep track of members of the Communist Party in the US, but it soon became much more than that, as the agency started investigating Soviet leaders between 1858 and 1977. While the operation was the brainchild of the FBI, the groundwork was conducted by three different people: Morris Childs, his wife Ava, and Jack Childs, his brother. Morris seemed to be the natural choice for this role, since he'd been a member of the Communist Party in the US, known by the acronym CPUSA, for many years. Hence, he was given the title of advisor to the International Department of the Central Committee, and awarded the Order of the Red Banner, which is bestowed upon those who have delivered impeccable service. Morris was trusted wholly by Soviet leaders, and at no point, while he was clandestinely working for the FBI, did they suspect that he was anything but loyal. He started gathering information on the Soviet Union's relationship with other communist countries, like China and Cuba. He was given the codename 58 when he, Ava, and Jack started to feel ever more uncomfortable with the Communist Party's ideals, and the three were quickly brought in by the FBI, knowing that they could be an invaluable tool to an operation such as Solo. They were given the title of FBI agents and traveled to these countries with no restrictions, since they were all trusted by each country's government as communists. Morris had close contact with Soviet leaders, and Ava remained at his side most of the time. Her job was to provide him with cover stories and alibis, while also transcribing different documents and messages that Morris received.
How do we know we can trust them, though? Wouldn't you think that's a huge gamble? Like, is it worth it? That's a huge, wouldn't you say that's a huge gamble?
When they got their hands on secret documents, they would make handwritten copies. These were then taped to their bodies before they flew back to the US, and once there, all of this valuable information would be handed over. As for Jack, he was responsible for overseeing the transfer of assets from the Soviet Union to CPUSA, and he reported that as much as $28 million had exchanged hands while he was monitoring the situation. With this information readily available, the US government virtually always knew what was going on in the Kremlin. They knew exactly which plans were being put in place and what the economic situation in the Soviet Union, China, and other communist countries was, but they also had a unique insight into what the Soviet leaders were concerned about. Furthermore, any vulnerability in the Soviet government was laid bare for the US government to see, and hence they were able to take advantage of those weaknesses and turn them into an even bigger advantage.
Now, the scary part about that is how many of those guys are working with Russia, China, that are over here that we think are our allies, or have infiltrated our army or some form of government. Because you do realize if we're doing it to them, you gotta know for sure that it's happening to us. So what do they know about us? This is the stuff that will keep you up at night.
All in all, Morris made 52 trips back and forth between the US and several communist countries, and by the time he was done, it had taken a serious physical toll on him. But the information that he was able to provide to the US was of the utmost importance. For example, he reported that the Cuban government had gotten word of the US's ideas to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. This report delayed the invasion until John F. Kennedy took over from Dwight Eisenhower. And when Kennedy decided to forge ahead with the plan, despite Morris's warning, the result was the Bay of Pigs invasion. When all was said and done, both Morris and Jack received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and in doing so, became the first two spies to ever be decorated in two different and very opposing countries. Number 9.
That don't feel right, man. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, you giving us all of this information. What are you telling them? What are you telling them? It's no way I could trust and believe that you're only funneling information to us and no one else. Like, spies aren't to be trusted.
Most people are familiar with the rumor that Lucille Ball, one of the stars of the hit TV show I Love Lucy, once inadvertently picked up radio broadcasts in her tooth fillings, and that she then used this ability to help the US spy on Japan. For the uninitiated, it started in 1942, while the Second World War was still in full swing. Lucille was in the midst of filming a movie one day, and she was driving home when she became aware that she was hearing music, and that it was emanating from her teeth. She believed her tooth fillings had somehow managed to broadcast music from a nearby radio station, and claimed that later on she also started picking up Morse code messages. She reported the strange event to the FBI, and according to legend, this information helped them track down and arrest a Japanese spy who was conducting operations from a tool shed while pretending to be working as a gardener. This story has never been proven or confirmed by the...
I was about to say, fam. Seriously? Your tooth filling? I've seen some strange things happen. Imagine yourself riding down the road and all of a sudden you're like, what is that? And then you realize it's coming from the inside of your mouth. And it's information helpful for the government to spy. No.
FBI. But one fact that is certain is that the agency did indeed have a file on Lucille, and it's now been declassified. In 1953, 11 years later, she was the subject of an investigation by the House Un-American Activities Committee, since she'd admitted to registering as a communist back in 1936. But when she was questioned about the decision, she claimed she'd only done so because it was the will of her grandfather who'd fallen gravely ill. She claimed to have never been an active member of the party, and that she actually had no ties to the organization. This seemed like a reasonable explanation, and the issue was dropped by the committee, but not by J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. He ordered that the investigation into Lucille's activities continue, and that her husband, Desi Arnaz, also be included in their inquiries. The declassified file shows that the FBI knew Lucille was slated by the communist newspaper, The Daily Worker, as being a vocal opponent of then-Senator Joseph McCarthy, along with a long list of other celebrities. The paper alleged that she was open about this stance at first, but that she then decided that it would be better if she didn't speak about it openly. But Arnaz was also soon on the FBI's radar. He had performed in a show that gained sponsorship from the Hollywood Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, which was seen by the FBI as a threat since they believed it to be a communist front of some kind. The performance was attended by FBI agents, and the declassified file contains notes about Arnaz's performance, other people in attendance, and the activities that they observed while at the show. The case for Lucille being a communist was only bolstered in 1973, when a Hollywood writer claimed that a communist meeting had taken place at her house. The writer claimed to have attended the meeting, but also made sure to mention that he never saw Lucille there, and that she was never in attendance. In the end, it seemed that Lucille's explanation for joining the Communist Party was indeed truthful, and that she wasn't actively involved in their activities after registering to vote as a communist. Number 8.
Listen, I don't blame Hoover. I don't trust it either. I wouldn't have trusted her either. That information, why didn't you divulge that information before? That something like that just can't slip your mind, or you forget to tell people about it. No. And you expect us to believe that? No. I'd have kept the eyes and tabs on her too. Both of them. Her and a man. Yep.
Nikola Tesla is considered to be one of the most influential inventors of all time. He was responsible for the creation of alternate current, the Tesla coil, neon lighting, and remote controls, and was instrumental in developing the radio, as well as the hydroelectric power plant that's located at Niagara Falls. But the FBI started investigating him and his inventions when he made mention of the fact that he was working on developing a device that he called a death ray. The agency was concerned that the ray could be used for nefarious purposes, especially if its design was to become known to the Soviet Union or anyone else who opposed the US government. They were also concerned about Tesla's ability to keep the design secret, since he'd started becoming ever more eccentric as he neared the end of his life, sometimes being seen tending to pigeons in his hotel room or being visibly repulsed by women who were wearing earrings. Most important of all, though, was the fact that if he were successful in creating the ray, it could be used by the US as a powerful weapon against their enemies. And so after Tesla passed away in 1943, agents descended on his hotel room and confiscated most of the papers that they could find. This resulted in a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories, as some people believed he'd actually finished the death ray and that the government now had it in its possession, a fact that made most of the public very uncomfortable. His nephew, Sava Kosanovic, hurried to the inventor's room as soon as he got word of his passing, but by the time he got there, Tesla's remains had already been taken away, and he noted that one particular black notebook, which contained some pages on the government, was missing, along with most of his papers. 2 days later, the rest of his personal belongings were seized by the Office of Alien Property. A specialist named John G. Trump was asked to study the papers, and after 3 days, he concluded that there were no real threats to the government, since Tesla's notes were mostly theoretical or speculative at best. The papers concerning the death ray were sent to Dayton, Ohio, specifically the Patterson Air Force Base. There, Brigadier General L.C. Craigie was tasked with testing Tesla's theories on the ray, and several experiments were conducted. The outcome of these experiments remains unknown, as the results were never published, and the project was eventually abandoned. But the mystery...
I wonder why there are so many conspiracy theories out there. You know, when somebody like this, who's a great and brilliant inventor, and have things like a death ray and stuff like that, and they want parts, and then this person ends up dead, and now they have the information, but you hear nothing from it. You wonder why we have all these conspiracy theories. Here's an example.
Surrounding the ray didn't end there. Following the discontinuation of the project, Tesla's papers on the subject mysteriously disappeared. Some of these papers have now been released to the public, but much of the information has been redacted or left out completely, only further fueling the imaginations of conspiracy theorists, many of whom still believe that the ray was indeed developed and possibly used by the US government. Number 7. Abbie Hoffman is remembered as being one of the Chicago Seven, a group of men who were put on trial by the US government after they were accused of crossing a border to incite a riot, taking part in anti-Vietnam War protests, and conspiracy. Hoffman was monitored by the FBI for several years, and the result was that his FBI file ended up being around 13,000 pages long, with one of the more entertaining parts being when he started publishing government records that were not meant for the public eye. It started in 1969, when Hoffman was in the process of writing a book called Woodstock Nation, and somehow the FBI got word that it contained anti-American sentiments. Needless to say, this was seen as unacceptable, and they set about doing everything they could to stop it from seeing the light of day. They managed to get a hold of a rough copy of the book, which detailed his personal experience at that year's famous Woodstock Festival, which doesn't sound like it would pose any kind of threat. But someone tipped them off that it contained a chapter on constructing explosive devices. While it's a very bad idea to publish this kind of information in any situation, the FBI learned that he'd gotten the recipe for the devices from the US Army's field manual, and they felt that Hoffman would be violating federal law by bringing up this knowledge to the public. But they were forced to end their investigation when it was determined that the manual had been declassified, and that it was therefore accessible to the public at any time. Hoffman could not be charged with any crime, and that section of the FBI's inquiry was quickly shut down. Woodstock Nation was published and released just a few months later, while the Chicago 7 were still on trial, during which Hoffman made fun of the proceedings, and in doing so, started currying favor with the press and the public who were following the case. All 7 members of the group were found guilty and sentenced accordingly, but they appealed their sentences, all of which were overturned. But the FBI was far from done with Hoffman in particular, as they charged him once more in 1974, claiming he'd been in possession of an illegal substance. Hoffman was adamant that he never possessed the substance, and that he was being framed by the police. He appeared in court and was given bail, after which he decided to go on the run. He had his face altered through plastic surgery, and for 6 years managed to evade capture. In 1980, his time as a fugitive came to an end when he decided to hand himself over, and ended up serving just 4 months on the illegal substance charge, instead of the 3 years that he faced originally. Number 6. Walt Disney was responsible for bringing joy into the houses of millions of people while he was alive, and his legacy lives on today as one of the most influential figures in children's entertainment. But not many people are aware that at one point in his life, he worked closely with the FBI, and that his file, which was put together by the agency, has now been declassified. Its contents revealed that Disney worked for the government as a spy in an effort to undermine union workers that he had employed.
So I guess it might be better to ask, who isn't a spy these days? Is there some statistic 1 out of every 5 people or persons is a spy? I need to know that statistic. Don't worry, I'm going to ask ChatGPT. Because now I'm starting to think everybody's a spy.
It all started in 1941 when animators decided to go on strike, and Disney appeared before the Healthcare Credit Union Association, where he accused several of the animators working for him of being communists. And so he was recruited by the agency to keep tabs on these workers. In return, he was given permission to film on property that was owned by the FBI, which at the same time ensured that he was kept safe from any resulting threats. 13 years later, Disney was given the title of Contact of Special Agent in Charge, and for the next 12 years, he worked as an informant for the FBI, making them aware of any workers in his employ that may have had ties to communism. He passed away in 1966, and at that point, the public was blissfully unaware that he'd been employed by the agency. But now, Disney's FBI file has been declassified, and his true involvement with the government is no longer a secret. It's now known that Disney and Hoover became fast friends while they were working together, and that the HUAC created a blacklist of Hollywood personalities that they saw as a threat to the US government for different reasons. Union leaders claimed that Disney animators decided to go on strike after he decided to fire them for being involved with activism, but Disney fired back, claiming he decided to terminate their employment because they'd been influenced by communism. The HUAC sided with Disney, and before long, animator David Hilberman's name was mentioned. It was speculated that he was some kind of anti-government radical when Disney learned that he had no interest in religion and that he had at some point studied direction at the Moscow Art Theater. Disney gave the FBI...
What if this is how Disney rose to power and gained its fame and different things like that? What if it was through the support of him being a spy? You know how people say that, Elon and his conflict of interest with the governmental contracts that he has and different things like that. It's not helping Tesla right now, but what if that's how, and there was some kind of way in return they assisted in Disney becoming the household name that it is today? Would that surprise y'all? It wouldn't me. Not at this point.
Permission to conduct meetings at Disneyland, and for agents and their families to spend time there at their leisure. He'd become so enamored with the agency that he decided to dedicate an episode of the Mickey Mouse Club show to the FBI, but this would serve more than one purpose. Disney felt that doing this would help children understand that there were many employment opportunities in the country, other than the mundane, and that they could contribute to what he called the American endeavor. At first, the idea was rejected, but in 1958, the narrative was finally broadcast. It focused on the character of a 13-year-old boy who was a member of the Mickey Mouse Club. He got the opportunity to meet J. Edgar Hoover, had his fingerprints taken, and watched as FBI agents unloaded their weapons at a mock-up of a bank robber, Babyface Nelson, who helped John Dillinger escape from prison. But the original script was altered by the FBI, since Disney initially included a scene where the boy was given a firearm to inspect, but the agency felt that this would be inappropriate and insisted that the scene be removed before the filming would commence. Number 5. People who are familiar with the phrase McCarthyism know that it refers to ex-US Senator Joseph McCarthy, who accused many people of being communists after the end of World War II. Many of those who were mentioned either lost their jobs or were blacklisted, despite there being no evidence that they were in any way associated with communism. Hence, in modern times, the phrase McCarthyism refers to a process where someone is accused of something without any incriminating evidence being presented, or where unfair investigative tactics are used to try and prove that someone is guilty of a crime that they didn't commit. When the war was finally...
Hey, that's still going on to this day. Once you get labeled as in a certain category, that thing, it follows you for the rest of your life. It does. And even if you're presumed innocent or you're proven innocent, it still follows you, which is the scary part about it. So yeah, that still happens to this day.
Over, the US became gripped by a fear of communism called the Red Scare, and virtually no sector of commerce was beyond suspicion. It comes as no surprise then that the film industry was being scoured for communists in case they decided to include their ideals and propaganda in movies or TV shows that were being made at the time. Hence, during the late 1940s and 50s, many people involved in the film industry were investigated by government agencies such as the FBI, one of which was the famous comedian Charlie Chaplin. This was no small matter, since anyone who was accused of being aligned with communism was placed on a blacklist and was unlikely to find work in Hollywood again. At the time, Chaplin had become a hugely influential character in the industry, which was an alarming situation in the eyes of the FBI. It would later come to light when Chaplin's FBI file was declassified that they had been collecting data on him from as early as 1922, since he was seen as a subversive and revolutionary. Furthermore, he hailed from London, England, and despite living in the US for much of his life, never attempted to become a citizen. The agency had also grown suspicious of him since he didn't conform to the cultural norms of the time. It was decided that Chaplin had to be investigated, since the FBI felt that many of his films contained communist propaganda, and hence they assumed that he had ties to communism, but they were having a hard time proving these theories. In an effort to learn more about Chaplin, they bugged his hotel room with listening devices and contacted MI5 in the UK in an attempt to glean as much information about him as possible, including what his real name was.
Yeah, I bet they didn't get a court order for that surveillance or for that wiretap that they had in his room. Yeah, Yeah, I bet that wasn't sent to a judge and they got a warrant to do that. Huh. Like how do they continue, like, they just get away with this? You know what? I get your suspicions. And I get you could say, well, if we don't do this, then some of the people that we have, that it's a slippery slope. Because they'll just make the argument saying that that's how we've taken down some of the greatest spies in history and different things. And they'll continue to use that to back up their reasoning for some of these illegal wiretaps and different things they're doing. That should scare y'all.
Gotten word that his birth name was Israel Thornstein and that he was actually born in France, not England. But they were told that Chaplin's real name was Charles Spencer Chaplin. But strangely, MI5 was unable to find his birth records, and hence agreed that he may have been born in a different country, or that he had changed his name at some point in his life. At one point, it was speculated that he came from Jewish heritage, something that was bad news for anyone in the film industry at the time, since many of those who were blacklisted were known to be Jewish, such as the Hollywood 10. This investigation would continue for many years until 1958, when it was finally decided that Chaplin was in no way a threat to the US government. They felt that he was likely a communist sympathizer, but that he wouldn't act on those beliefs. Number 4. The famous author, Truman Capote, is remembered for his novella, Breakfast at Tiffany's, which was later turned into a film by the same name, starring Audrey Hepburn, George Peppard, and Mickey Rooney, among many others that he authored. But not many people know that he was investigated by the FBI, and that his file, which contains over 100 pages of information, is now available to the public. Capote was just one of many authors who were being investigated after it was found that they supported the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The committee had been set up in New York and Canada after it was established by Robert Tabor in 1960, and sought to provide support to the Cuban Revolution. Among the other authors that were being investigated were Allen Ginsberg, Gore Vidal, and Norman Mailer, all of whom were thought to have had associations with the FPCC. On the 6th of April 1960, the FBI started to grow concerned when they came across an ad in the New York Times in which the FPCC challenged the US government's stance against the Cuban Revolution. But 3 years later, the group would be dismantled when the American public started to become ever more paranoid over the communist threat, and after then-President John F. Kennedy's life was ended by Lee Harvey Oswald, who was believed to be a communist sympathizer since he defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, before eventually returning to the US. At the time, Capote was in the midst of writing his nonfiction novel, titled In Cold Blood, which was published in 1966. It was a detailed account of the investigation of the Clutter family, who had their lives ended in November of 1959 in Holcomb, Texas. 2 former prisoners, Perry Smith and Richard Hancock, were eventually found to be the ones responsible for the crime, and after being found guilty, were both executed in 1965. But before they were even named as suspects, Capote heard about the tragedy and traveled to Kansas to get as many details as possible. He and his close friend Harper Lee conducted interviews with witnesses and spoke to investigators who worked on the case, all the while taking notes of everything they learned. The result was what many people still consider to be the very first nonfiction novel, and when it was released, it was an instant success. It told of how the 2 criminals hatched their plan to make a big score by robbing the family's farmhouse, as well as Smith and Hancock's attempts to evade the law. They fled to New Mexico after carrying out the crime, but soon ran out of money, and after being forced to cash several bad checks, they had no choice but to return to the US. Once there, they were apprehended, and it came to light that the 2 robbers mistakenly believed that Herb Cutter kept all of his money in a safe in the house, making it the perfect target. But in reality, Cutter only used checks instead of cash, and when the robbery was concluded, the pair fled with just $50 in their pockets. After their capture, the 2 turned on each other, with Smith claiming that Hancock had ended the family's lives, but Hancock claimed that Smith was responsible for ending at least 2 of their lives. In the end, Capote was found to not have any real ties to communism, and the investigation into his life was ended, but not before his file was filled with as many as 100 pages, much of which was mere speculation rather than fact. Number 3. According to the FBI memorandum on famous author Helen Keller, The agency never conducted a full-scale investigation into her life, but they have admitted to collecting information on her life, since they believe that she was a communist sympathizer. Helen was born in Tuscumbia, Alabama in 1880, but her life took a tragic turn when she contracted a mysterious illness, thought to possibly have been scarlet fever when she was just 19 months old. As a result, she was left blind and deaf for the rest of her life, which would be a massive hurdle for most people. But after she was examined by Alexander Graham Bell in 1886, he decided to send her to a 20-year-old teacher named Anne Sullivan. Sullivan was employed by the Perkins Institute for the Blind, which was based in Boston, Massachusetts, and was under the direction of Bell's son-in-law. Bell knew that Sullivan was an amazing teacher, and his hope was that she could teach Helen to read and write. Just a few months later, Helen had learned to identify different objects by touch, and then learned to spell these objects' names using her fingers in the palm of her hand. She was then taught to read raised words that had been written on pieces of cardboard.
Now, I know, a lot of people, they're a sucker for a good story and situation and stuff like that. But this would be the perfect disguise as a spy situation. Somebody who's blind, who we wouldn't expect, we would have sympathy for and empathy for, we wouldn't necessarily bat an eye or pay attention to. So that's why I'm sitting here like, oh, hey, let's check her out. Let's keep her under observation. We can do that from a distance.
And before long, she was writing complete sentences, something that she'd not been able to do for the first 6 years of her life. In 1890, she had started to learn to read Braille, but that's when her first truly daunting challenge began, learning to speak. She relocated to a school for the deaf, where her teacher, Sarah Fuller, took her under her wing. She then learned to lip read, and before long became an excellent student. She first studied at the Wright Humason School for the Deaf, and at the age of 16, attended the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, which was located in Massachusetts. Following this, she attended Radcliffe College, from where she graduated in 1904. But she would soon come under the US government's radar, after she started sympathizing with the striking mill workers in Little Falls, New York, and writing about civil rights. The FBI then started gathering information on Helen, and in her file, which is no longer secret, the first page contains a letter to J. Edgar Hoover, asking for information on funding that was being provided to state institutions for the blind. It also notes that Keller was a signatory on an American Friends of Spanish Democracy petition to end the arms embargo against Spain in 1938. The FBI considered this group to be distinctly un-American, and speculated that it may have been a front for a communist organization. Hence, they started gathering as much information on Keller as possible, in case she really did have ties to communism. When news about the petition was published in the Daily Worker,
Here's a question. What's their protocol when they're caught? What's a spy's protocol when they get caught or they've done something? I ain't typing that in. Now, I'm not asking ChatGPT that. All right. I've done enough, I think, So, but that's why I'm just posing the question. What do y'all think is the protocol for them when they're caught, they're in capture? Because if they're caught, they're going to be heavily interrogated somewhere in a remote location. And it's probably going to get sickening, the stuff they're going to do to them to get the information out. Right? So I was just curious about that, but I ain't typing that in.
Communist newspaper. It raised many eyebrows, especially since Helen's name was mentioned. Her name would appear in the paper once again when it was reported that she would be a speaker at a memorial meeting for the Friends of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was a group of Americans that fought for the Republicans in Spain during the 1930s. The Special Committee on Un-American Activities considered this group to be a communist front, and once again, Helen was on the FBI spotlight. But no proof was ever found that she was involved in communism, and her file was sealed when this finally became apparent. Number 2. It'll come as no surprise that the FBI created a massive file on the notorious businessman and gangster Al Capone. It consists of over 2,400 pages detailing most of his life from when he became a notorious gangster in Chicago to the end of it in Florida. In 1930, Capone was
That's why when I be seeing these people walking around thinking that nobody's paying attention to what they're doing, especially if they've made it high up the ladder and whatever type of endeavors they're involved in, whether it be drugs or it be whatever, laundering money or whatever they're doing. Like, these jokers be having files on them. Files. This is the same thing we see in the whole JFK situation and how they had so much information on Oswald and so much information on others. Like, y'all think y'all be getting past it. No, they be on them.
Was branded by the US government as public enemy number 1, having become one of the most dangerous gangsters the country had ever seen. But his life of crime started long before that, when he was still a young boy. He became involved with the street gang, and when he landed his first real job, it was at a saloon owned by mobster Johnny Torrio. He started work there as a dishwasher, but soon became a bartender, and eventually started carrying out jobs for Torrio, along with his fellow gangsters. When he got married and had a child, he knew he had to make a lot of money to support his family, and so he took on more dangerous jobs. He eventually relocated to Chicago, where he became Torrio's right-hand man. Torrio then relocated back to New York, leaving Capone in charge of the gang's operations in Chicago, and before long he'd become a very wealthy and feared man. He became somewhat of an icon that spoke freely to the press despite being accused of some heinous crimes. He started dressing in vibrant colored suits and seemed to truly enjoy all of the attention he was getting. But all this changed on the 14th of February, 1929, the day that the St. Valentine's Day massacre took place. A group of gangsters, thought to be under Capone's orders, rounded up 7 of rival gangster Bugs Moran's people while dressed as police officers and proceeded to end their lives without any mercy. This event shifted the public's perception of organized crime, and newspapers started publishing far less flattering articles about the crime boss. President Herbert Hoover announced that Capone was now the government's main target, and he was charged with bootlegging. Capone declined to appear in court, stating he'd fallen ill while in Miami, but the FBI traveled to his house and found him to be in perfect health. He was making bets at racetracks and had gone on vacation when he claimed to be bedridden. He was found in contempt of court and summarily arrested. He posted bail but was soon back in prison when he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon. While he was in prison, Capone's bootlegging businesses were raided, but it would be a lesser charge that spelled his end as a crime boss. He was charged with tax evasion after one of his accountants was forced to admit that he'd been hiding money from the IRS. He was also hit with 5,000 counts of violating the Prohibition Act, but he was offered a deal. If he changed his plea to guilty, he would only spend 2.5 years behind bars, and by all accounts he jumped at the chance. But Judge James Wilkerson decided to reject the deal, and Capone had no choice but to stand trial. He was found guilty of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison, most of which was spent in Alcatraz. But he was released in 1939 when it was discovered that the syphilis that he'd contracted many years earlier had started having an effect on his mental state. Quite unbelievably, he was never charged or convicted of a single violent crime, and according to the FBI file, the tax evasion charge was the only way the government could get him off the streets for good. Number 1. The declassified
See, and do we believe that syphilis is what got him out? Or did he turn state's witness? That's possibly could be a thing. You never really know, but you have to think about it in the back of your mind. That just seems like a bogus story. Something he had before he went in, got out of control, started to mess with his brain and his functioning, and now he's out. I guarantee it's a lot of people locked up right now who have things affecting their mental status. They ain't coming home. They ain't coming home.
FBI file on lawyer and Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Abe Fortas, makes for some very interesting reading, since it paints the U.S. Supreme Court in a less than favorable light. These revelations were brought to light by author Alex Charnes in his book, which is entitled FBI Snitches, Blackmail, and Obscene Ethics at the Supreme Court. It details his 13-year effort to gain access to FBI files on Fortas, but at first the agency vehemently denied that any such records existed. But Charnes didn't take no for an answer, and after filing 3 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, he was finally able to obtain the information that he was looking for. He later stated that he was inspired by the work of Dave Garrow, who served as a mentor and who would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Dr. Martin Luther King and the FBI's involvement in his life. Garrow had obtained the information from his book via a Freedom of Information Act request, and so Charnes was well prepared when he started digging for information on Fortas. When he learned that the FBI had blackmailed King, he assumed that similar threats had to have been made against individuals serving the liberal Warren Court. And so he started his investigation into the U.S. Supreme Court and Chief Justice Earl Warren, but he immediately hit a dead end when the FBI denied having any documentation on Abe Fortas. But he refused to accept this as an answer. He then asked for his own FBI file to be released on him, and this request was granted. Since he'd made so many Freedom of Information requests, the file was more than 1,000 pages long, and inside he found a note titled Left-Wing Law Clerks, which referenced a file on the Supreme Court. He then uncovered allegations by the FBI that Fortas was homosexual, information they garnered from an informant who claimed that he'd been in a relationship with Fortas before he became a justice of the court. Fortas was informed of these allegations by order of Hoover, who claimed that Fortas needed to be aware of these claims for his own protection. Fortas denied the claims, but in 1968,
boy, if they don't get you, they're going to still get you some type of way. This is the scary part about it no one talks about, fam. Because if they don't get you, one way they can humiliate you to where it affects anything you got going on, maybe business or anything. If they just start putting out scandalous you get deep in the thick of it now, boys.
Hoover sent another agent to inform Fortas that he'd been seen at a homosexual bar by an informant. In response, Fortas immediately resigned from the Supreme Court, resulting in many people speculating that he was indeed homosexual, and that he decided to step down since this orientation was seen as unacceptable at the time, and to save his family from the resulting humiliation, were he to oppose the informant's claims. But not everyone is convinced. It was speculated that Fortas was in fact heterosexual, and that the entire report was fabricated to force him into resigning from the Supreme Court, and this meant that J. Edgar Hoover was directly responsible for blackmailing a justice of the court, something that was not expected of the director of the FBI. William Berger was appointed as Chief Justice.
And I think it's still going now. It's happening now more than ever. Just look at a lot of these news outlets and things like that. You don't think this stuff is just coming out about people, on purpose? Like, even I don't care how you feel about Diddy. At some point in time, you was like, goodness gracious, another one is coming out? Another one is coming out? At some point in time, you had to sit back to yourself and say, this is not normal. Why is all of this coming out like this? It's just interesting.
Justice, and Harry Blackmun as Associate Justice, leading to rumors that they were the preferred candidates over Fortas, and that the FBI went to unprecedented lengths to ensure that they were appointed in his stead. These rumors have now finally been proven as true thanks to the Freedom of Information Act and declassified FBI files.